My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 34 years old, and for the last 3 years, I have been working as a cardiothoracic surgeon in one of the busiest hospitals in North Carolina. I've cracked open a chest right in the emergency room when a patient's heart stopped right before my eyes. I've held in my hands the very organ that a human life depends on, and made it beat again when no one else believed it was still possible. And last summer, my mother introduced me to her church choir friends as the girl who helps out at the hospital. That day, my nephew almost drowned, and everything that happened next became the breaking point after which nothing in our family was ever the same again. Welcome to a story where the truth isn't swept under the rug. If you've ever been invalidated by the people who were supposed to know you best, you will understand every single word. On the eve of that day, I had worked 18 hours straight. 3 surgeries. A cardiac rupture after a highway accident. An elderly man with an aneurysm. A 16-year-old girl after an overdose. Cardiac arrest right on the table. I stood over her, counting the seconds while the anesthesiologist called out the blood pressure dropping to 0. I performed open heart massage, and it came back. She survived. I walked out of the operating room at 3 in the morning, my hands shaking not from exhaustion, but from the adrenaline surge that hadn't had time to fade. Nurse Julie, who had been working there since my internship days, looked at me and said, "Carter, go home. You look like you lost a fight with a truck." I smirked and replied that I'd finish my notes first. She left me a cup of coffee. It went cold. I drank it anyway. That was when the text from my brother arrived. "Lake House, Saturday. Everyone will be there. Come." I stared at the screen for a long time. At the hospital, they called me Dr. Carter. At home, they called me anything but that. I grew up in a small town outside Charlotte. My father, Richard Carter, owned a construction company. A true hard-working man. He only respected what you could hold in your hands. My mother, Mary, lived a life where the most important things were the neighbors' opinions and Sunday service. My brother Daniel was their pride and joy. The heir. The one who would carry on the business. And I was the quiet girl with her books. When I got into medical school, my mother asked, "And how much longer is this going to take?" I answered, "Until I become a doctor." She sighed and turned the conversation to Daniel's new truck. It was always like that. When I became a doctor, nothing changed. When I got my specialization, nothing changed. When I started saving lives, nothing changed. In their eyes, I was still just helping out at the hospital. I almost didn't go to that family weekend. But that evening, my nephew called me. "Aunt Evie, are you coming?" I learned how to swim. I closed my eyes. He was the only one who saw the real me. "I'm coming," I said. And that decision changed everything. I arrived at the lake house on Saturday morning. The heat was unbearable. The air was thick, heavy. Music, laughter, the smell of grilled meat and people. Too many people. Mom stood in the center, as always, playing the host. She saw me and smiled. "Oh, here's Evelyn. She works at the hospital." The woman next to her asked, "A nurse?" Mom nodded. I looked her straight in the eyes. "I am a cardiothoracic surgeon." The woman was surprised. Mom had already turned away. As if I hadn't said a word, as if the truth simply didn't fit into her version of the world. I stood on the porch, feeling a familiar sensation. Invisibility. Christina, my brother's wife, walked up to me. "You made it after all. We thought you were busy with your whatever it is you do." I answered calmly. "I operate on people." She laughed. "Oh, sounds serious." She wasn't listening. She never listened. Dad was sitting with a beer, discussing my brother's projects with his friends. "Daniel built this house with his own hands." I walked over. "Dad, last week I performed open heart surgery," he nodded. "That's good." A pause. "Daniel is expanding the business now." That was it. As always, I found my nephew by the water. He hugged me like I was his whole world. "Look, I'm swimming." I noticed it immediately. The depth, the lack of flotation devices, no supervision whatsoever. I asked my brother, "Where is the lifebuoy?" He brushed it off. "It's a lake, Evie." Relax. I didn't relax. I stayed to watch, because I knew how things could end. And that exact knowledge saved a life. Later, as the sun dipped lower, the adults stopped paying attention. Alcohol. Conversations. Laughter. The kids were in the water, unsupervised. I sat on the edge of the dock watching every movement. And then I heard my mother's voice. She was talking to the guests. "Evelyn, she's, well, Does something at the hospital. Phones, I think. Laughter, lighthearted, as if that were normal, as if that were true. At that moment, something inside me broke completely, but I didn't stand up, I didn't scream, because in that very second, I saw something else. My nephew. He had gone out further, too far. He stopped staying afloat. A second. Hands up. Panic. No one saw. Except me. I was already running. A dive into the water. The cold hit my body. I submerged, found him underwater, grabbed him, lifted him up. He wasn't breathing. I pulled him onto the dock. Colin's a scream. Shock. Silence. And I went to work. Like always. Clear-headed, coldly efficient, professionally. Because right now, I wasn't the girl from the hospital. I was the only person who could save him. And it was in that exact moment that all their lies began to crumble. Chaos erupted around me. Screams, footsteps, someone dropped a glass. Someone was calling for Daniel. But all of it was just noise. I didn't hear anything unnecessary. I saw only the child in front of me, unconscious, not breathing. His skin was already turning pale. I checked his pulse, weak, almost non-existent. "Everyone back away," I said sharply. And this time, they heard me. Not because they recognized who I was, but because there was no room for doubt in my voice. I tilted his head back, cleared his airway, pinched his nose, and started rescue breathing. 1, 2, 3. Then compressions, rhythm, precise, honed by years of practice. My body remembered better than my mind. Breathe, come on, breathe. I wasn't saying it to him. I was saying it to myself, because I knew how much time we had, and how fast it was slipping away. Someone nearby started crying. Christina. Mom stood off to the side, holding her hand over her mouth. Dad froze. Daniel ran up, but stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't know what to do. But I did, and I was doing it. The seconds stretched out. I counted, not out loud. Inside, just like in the operating room, like always. And then, a jerk. Coughing, water. He took a sharp breath in, deep, gasping, alive. I immediately rolled him onto his side, monitoring his breathing. Breathe easy, it's okay. I'm right here. His small body was shaking in my arms, but he was breathing. Alive. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. 7 minutes that could have cost him his life. The paramedic jumped out of the rig, saw me, and immediately asked, "Who started CPR?" I looked at him. I did. He nodded. "Are you a doctor?" Yes, he didn't ask for details. That was enough for him. We loaded the boy into the rig. I rode with them. Daniel tried to climb in after us, but I stopped him. "Let us work." He looked at me for the first time that day for real. Without a filter. Without his usual role. Just looked. And stepped back. In the ambulance, I monitored his condition. His breathing stabilized. His pulse was strengthening, but a risk remained. There is always a risk. I explained to the paramedic. Submersion incident, brief respiratory arrest. Resuscitation about 1 minute. He wrote it down. "Which hospital are you from?" I named it. He looked at me more closely. "Carter. Are you that Dr. Carter?" I didn't answer. Right now, it didn't matter. When we arrived at the hospital, everything clicked into automatic mode. The doors flew open. The gurney moved forward, and I walked alongside it. Not as an aunt anymore, as a doctor. Male, 5 years old, near drowning, spontaneous breathing restored, potential hypoxia. My voice sounded precise, fast. The ER paused for a fraction of a second, because they recognized me. "Dr. Carter?" The nurse snapped her eyes up. "Yes, I'm taking the case." One of the doctors nodded. No questions. No doubts. Because here, I didn't need to explain who I was. Here they knew. Here they saw. Here they respected. We transferred him to the ICU, monitoring, observation, labs. I didn't leave his side. Until I made sure he was stable, he was gonna live. And only after that did I step out into the hallway. They were there. All of them. Mom, Dad, Daniel, Christina. The very same people to whom I was just the girl with the phones. They were looking at me and staying silent. I took off my gloves, slowly, like after a surgery. "He's going to live." I silence. Christina burst into tears. Daniel sat down on a chair. Dad ran a hand over his face, and Mom was looking at me as if she were seeing me for the very first time. "You," she began. I raised my hand, stopped her, calmly, without shouting. "No, Mom." I walked closer. And for the first time in my entire life, I didn't try to explain. I simply spoke the truth. "I am not a nurse." A pause. "Not an assistant." A pause. "Not a nanny." I looked her straight in the eyes. "I am a doctor who just saved your grandson's life." The words hung in the air. Heavy, irrevocable. Dad lowered his eyes. Daniel stood up. He walked up to me slowly. "Evie?" I shook my head. You knew. He froze. Because it was the truth. He knew, always knew, but stayed silent. I shifted my gaze to Mom. You knew too, she said softly. No, I stopped her. You chose not to see. The silence became thick, almost tangible. I took a step back, and today it almost cost him his life. Those words hit hardest of all. Mom closed her eyes. Tears. But I didn't soften it anymore, didn't smooth it over, didn't carefully pick my words, because the truth doesn't owe anyone convenience. I turned around and walked toward the exit. I needed to get outside, to breathe. To stop. Because only now did my hands start to shake. Not during the rescue, not during resuscitation, but now, when it was all over, when it was safe to feel. I went outside, sat down on the steps, and for the first time in a long time, allowed myself to just sit. Without a role, without fighting, without the need to prove anything. The door behind me opened. I knew who it was. Without turning around. Evie Daniel sat next to me. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said softly, I'm proud of you. I closed my eyes, and that hurt worse than if he had said nothing at all, because those words weren't there when they were actually needed. It's too late, I answered calmly. He nodded. Understanding. For the first time. For real. But the hardest part was still ahead, because a single rescue doesn't undo years of neglect, and a truth once spoken aloud leaves no path to go back. I returned to the ICU an hour later, when the emotions in the hallway had cooled down a bit. My nephew was lying under an IV line. A healthy color was already returning to his little face, and the monitor above his bed was tracing a steady, rhythmic graph. A real, living sinus rhythm. I sat on the edge of the cot and took his hand. He opened his eyes, looked at me, and smiled faintly. Aunt Evie? Did I dive really deep? Very deep, kiddo, I replied, feeling a lump rise in my throat. But you did great. But he fell asleep a couple of minutes later, still clutching my finger. And in that moment, I finally understood one simple thing. I would never again have to seek validation from people who chose to remain blind. My worth does not depend on whether they are capable of seeing it. When I walked out of the room, my parents were still in the hallway. Daniel had taken Christina home, but Mom and Dad were waiting. Mom took a step toward me. In her hands was a plastic cup of cold hospital coffee, identical to the one I had drunk at 3 a.m. today. For the first time in my memory, she didn't look like a confident, self-righteous woman from church, but like a lost, aged mother whose perfect facade had collapsed in a single instant. Evelyn, she started softly. We're going to stay here for the night. I ordered some food. You must be hungry? She was trying to step backward, back into her comfortable routine where everything could be smoothed over with care, domestic little chores, and cherry pie. I'm not hungry. Evie, Dad chimed in. His voice, usually loud and confident, now sounded muffled. We were wrong. We didn't understand. I looked at both of them. At my father, who had spent his whole life measuring success only by what his sons had built. At my mother, who was ashamed of a profession where you had to get your hands bloody, preferring to invent convenient fairy tales for her friends instead. You understood everything, I said calmly. It was just more convenient for you that way. Daniel's office, his trucks, his job sites, that made sense to you. But my life required effort from you just to comprehend it. It was easier for you to devalue what I do than to admit that your daughter went somewhere you could never reach. Mom lowered her eyes. Tears dripped straight into the cold coffee. What are we supposed to do now? She asked almost in a whisper. Stop lying, I answered. First and foremost, to yourselves. I didn't start a scene. I didn't scream or unleash 10 years of built-up resentment. The medical profession teaches you one crucial thing. When a patient is in critical condition, it's pointless to blame them for their illness. You just have to act. And our family relationships had been in intensive care for a long time. I left them my personal phone number to give to the doctor on duty and walked into the locker room. The next morning, I was standing at the surgical sink. Hot water, antiseptic, a stiff scrub brush. I scrubbed my arms up to the elbows, stroke after stroke, washing away the remnants of the lake water, the smell of someone else's fear and the sticky feeling of family drama. The door to the operating room opened. An assistant walked in, checking the charts. Dr. Carter. The patient is on the table. Triple coronary artery bypass graft. We're ready. I rinsed off the foam, held my sterile hands up, and looked at my reflection in the door's glass. There was no girl with her books standing there anymore. There was no hospital assistant. Standing there was a person who knows the true price of every single second of a human life. A person who knows exactly who she is. I stepped into the operating room under the cold surgical lights. "Scalpel," I said, and the world fell back into place.